The Proxima Dia gate ruptured in silence, but the screams it trapped never left the transit buffer. No alarms, no warnings, just a sudden flattening of all sensor readouts as the wormhole lattice collapsed mid-transfer. The convoy, a mixed column of Terran diplomats, engineers, and civilian families, was halfway through a secure re-entry protocol when the collapse hit. A ripple, then a shearing blink. Emergency buffers flickered to life, failed to stabilize, and vanished in a hard cut. Inside Earth's monitoring array, 342 transmission signatures simply stopped. Not jammed, not redirected, just absent. The kind of absence that leaves teeth marks in the silence. Within minutes, backup buffers tried to reconstruct what had happened. They failed. Not due to physical damage, but because the gate firmware had been rewritten on the fly, its handshake libraries replaced mid-cycle by a Ivanti override patch, one that hadn't been disclosed. Not to Earth, not to the Unified Corridor's diplomatic lattice, not to anyone outside the Dominion's inner quorum. Earth's legal liaisons flagged the incident immediately, demanding gate logs, kernel replays, even just a copy of the runtime patch for forensic review. What they got instead was a formal statement wrapped in the cold phrasing of galactic bureaucracy. Containment measure activated due to anomalous quantum drift detected in Sol-linked return protocols. All assets reclassified as lost under Safeguard Doctrine 7.4.b. Halran Vex didn't need translation. He'd seen that language before. It wasn't a malfunction. It was erasure with a paper trail. The Dominion's logic was surgical. With Earth no longer operationally compliant, they routed around it. Within hours, trade lanes shifted. Corridors recalibrated to omit Terran gates. Neutral embassies hosting Earth's envoys began severing access, citing temporary realignment. Half of Earth's outermost diplomatic outposts, places like Carthis Station, Rhinel Hub, and the Laronte Path, simply went dark. And just like that, a civilization that had fought to earn its place at the diplomatic table was declared absent by procedural default. Earth's channels flooded with canned condolences, none with actual access keys. They had been removed not with fire, but with firmware. Halran was 2 sectors away when the transmission reached him. He'd been monitoring anti-piracy corridors along the Dresda Loop under a civilian cover, gathering asset relocation data. His role at Aegir Command was mostly dormant, strategic intelligence that rarely activated outside collapse scenarios. Until now. His ship redirected without explanation. No ceremony, no debrief. Just a silent escort drone that led him into Europa's deep-water black zone where high-clearance analysts and threat response teams worked beneath 60 meters of reinforced ice. There, in the cold hush of the bunker's war room, they played the Proxima Dia rupture on a loop. The same loop everyone else saw, except Halran didn't look at the gate. He looked at the moment before it, at the firmware sync mismatch, at the fact that the update, signed by Ivanti signature keys, had been pushed seconds before transit confirmation. There was no time for a human system to counter-authorize. It wasn't an accident. It was a cutoff, surgical, deliberate, and cloaked in legally defensible ambiguity. He stared at the frame again and again, jaw locked, as one of the analysts muttered about awaiting audit rights. Halran had stopped listening. On the table beside the display sat a hardline message shard, fragmented, unstable, and half-corrupted from the gate collapse. It contained the last personal communication recovered from the convoy, not telemetry, not threat logs. A message, one he almost didn't open. It was from Dr. Nevin Rusk, a xenometallurgist Halran had once trained personally on off-grid diplomatic rotations. Nevin had joined the diplomatic science envoy to Proxima Dia only a year prior. His message wasn't professional, it was hopeful, naive even. A short update about how his son had taken his first steps in microgravity, how his wife had finally gotten clearance to open a medical outreach on Eos Ridge, how he hoped, when this symposium was done, Halran might finally come visit. "You were right about them being jumpy," Nevan had said in closing, "but I think we're showing them we belong. I really think it's turning." The file ended mid-bite, his voice flattening into static. Halran didn't speak for a long time after that. The room waited, quietly watching him. When he finally rose, his voice was even, but his hands were steady in a way that made the others uneasy. "They'll call for restraint," he said. "Containment diplomacy, internal probes. We'll send envoys through alternate channels. We'll ask for answers no one plans to give." He glanced once more at Nevin's frozen face, pixelated and drifting through the distortion. "They erased us. Clean. Bureaucratically. And they'll do it again. Unless we make it impossible." A junior strategist asked what he planned to do. Halran didn't respond directly. He tapped into a buried access layer that hadn't been opened in decades. Not during pirate incursions, not even during the Scour War. It was known only to former envoys, trained for eventualities that no one liked to speak of. On Europa's secure grid, the words lit up slowly. Directive Nadir. Status: dormant. He keyed in a single authentication string. The status changed to active. No declaration, no war footing, no threats, just quiet, clinical reactivation. Directive Nadir wasn't designed for vengeance, it was designed for survival when every diplomatic corridor had failed, and every voice Earth once trusted had gone silent. It wasn't a plan of attack. It was a blueprint for what came after being erased. And Halran, whose name had once been on peace accords, now stood in a room full of silent analysts and empty channels, staring at a gate that no longer recognized their signatures, and whispered, "Fine. If they closed it, we build our own." The Orion Scar had long been abandoned by official traffic, its old relay grid a rusting skeleton of humanity's early push into the stars. Once a proud trade lane bristling with embassies and open ports, it had been rendered obsolete when the unified corridors were established and Earth's newer gate alignment stabilized. What remained was drift metal and ghost code, buried in forgotten relays orbiting lifeless moons or fused into the husks of merchant platforms long since declared unsalvageable. But Directive Nadir had been written with these dead channels in mind. It didn't rely on current infrastructure, it thrived in its absence. Halran's activation signal rippled through the void like a whisper, reawakening decades-old handshake protocols. The old beacons stirred, not with full broadcast power, but with short-range pulses that would only be detected by those who already knew to listen. And they did. In scrapyard guilds, in backroom trade markets, in the hidden listening decks of derelict traffic posts, Earth's embedded agents began receiving their summons. They were not soldiers. They were information runners, contract coders, off-grid splicers, individuals who had traded titles and countries for silence and survival. Now they were being asked to piece together a narrative the rest of the galaxy was too busy rewriting. The fragments began to arrive within hours. They came as partial logs, intercepted manifest changes, garbled comms between Ivanti patrol ships. Nothing singularly damning, just patterns, recordings of empty transports reclassified as combat frames, civilian relay towers flagged as forward observation arrays, human trade signatures overwritten mid-route, replaced with scrambled pings that conveniently matched piracy profiles. It wasn't just blockade, it was narrative warfare. The Avanti weren't hiding Earth. They were remaking it as an aggressor by default, assembling a paper trail of provocations that, in isolation, looked suspicious, but when strung together, painted a case for preemptive containment. Halran watched the web unfold with mechanical precision. He spoke little. His focus shifted to Phase 2 of Directive Nadir, the counter-passage initiative. If they could no longer use the unified lattice to travel, then they would build their own access point outside the jurisdiction of Dominion control. But it couldn't look like a gate, and it couldn't come from Earth's military channels. So Halran authorized the commissioning of a civilian mining experiment under Europa's South Polar Cap. A shell company, Orbital Resonance Exploration Ltd., filed for excavation permits, citing interest in magnetic core interactions and gravity flux measurements. The application was routine, the site remote, and the paperwork airtight. What no one outside Halran's chain knew was that the facility wasn't designed to dig. It was designed to open. Beneath the glacial shelf, modular teams began assembling salvaged aperture drives, decommissioned ring segments from old transport hubs, power regulators pulled from retired orbital elevators, phase spinners repurposed from quantum test beds. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, just a patchwork of forgotten technology reinterpreted under civilian scope. To the engineers, it was a research project. To the Dominion, invisible. Halloran didn't rely on invisibility alone. He layered the operation in misdirection. Human misinformation units, operating under obsolete diplomatic codes, began injecting falsified quantum flux alerts into Ivanti surveillance networks. Each burst suggested minor instabilities near former Terran corridors, mimicking the exact readings that preceded the Proxima Dia rupture. The Dominion reacted predictably. Fleet segments were dispatched to investigate, rerouting long-range patrols and drawing sensor attention away from Europa. Every hour they spent chasing phantom anomalies bought Earth more time to complete the real build. Still, the window was closing. Earth's Strategic Council, unaware of the covert aperture, had begun preparing formal diplomatic protest filings. They were considering public appeals to the Unified Tribunal, petitions that would, if filed, signal desperation and legally affirm Earth's dependence on unified infrastructure. If they submitted, the message would be clear. Earth acknowledged the closure as legitimate. That could not be allowed. Halloran received the update in silence, standing over Europa's construction zone as the aperture arms were carefully aligned beneath meters of reinforced glacial shell. The crew thought they were preparing a containment array for core resonance testing. Their precision was unmatched. They didn't know what they were building. And Halloran couldn't tell them. Not yet. The ring was still incomplete. The power load balancing remained unstable. Any delay could compromise the entire configuration. But there was no time left. That evening, Halloran stood alone on the observation platform above the ice-buried chamber, watching as teams below calibrated the final resonance nodes. Steam hissed from thermal regulators, casting everything in a fog that glowed faintly under amber lighting. He had spent a career mastering diplomacy, knowing how to speak carefully, when to yield, how to survive by being allowed in the room. But Earth had been locked out, not with bombs, but with silence. This gate wouldn't shout. It wouldn't scream. It would simply appear and make erasure impossible. He keyed in a personal relay code, one that linked directly to an old confidant still inside Council networks. "You've got 72 hours, he said. "Hold them off, delay the filings, tell them the data's incomplete. Use whatever excuse you can, but do not let them make it official." The voice on the other end was hesitant. "They'll want to know why." "Because if we play by their rules," Halloran said quietly, watching the aperture arms click into place, "we lose by design." And below, without fanfare or announcement, the last segment of the ring rotated into its cradle, silent, stable, and waiting to be lit. Out in the derelict dead zones of the Orion Scar, Ivanti fleet squadrons swept through radiation-burned corridors and hollowed orbital husks with grim efficiency. Their long-range sensors tracked erratic energy signatures, precise mimics of Earth's gate flux patterns, each ping placed just close enough to resemble a failing aperture, but far enough to trigger second-guessing. What they found, sector after sector, was nothing. Burnt wreckage, leaky beacons. Sometimes not even that. There were no ambushes, no retreating Earth vessels, no secret fleets lying in wait. Just silence, salted with false readings that always stayed one vector ahead. It was as if humanity had collapsed and left only smoke behind. Aboard the command ring of the war dreadnought, Ishor-Veth, Ivanti Admiral Corvan stood motionless, as projection after projection flickered with report updates. Every intercepted signal, every destabilized gate metric pointed to the same illusion: Earth's infrastructure crumbling under its own mismanagement. And yet, he couldn't shake the unease. Earth didn't behave this way. Their culture favored stubborn reaction, not retreat. Yet here, they offered no statement, no protest, no retaliation. That absence gnawed at him deeper than any threat could. "They are broken," muttered one of the junior tacticians. "This is collapse. We need only to direct cleanup before other systems fill the gap." But the elder strategists weren't so eager. Debate broke out among the War Council, the diplomatic branches advising restraint, the military wing circling talks of preemptive annexation. If Earth was truly failing, then the time to move was now. But hesitation lingered. The signs were too clean, too staged. One senior aide posed the question no one wanted to answer. What if they wanted us to think this was collapse? The debate ended without resolution, leaving orders unchanged. Maintain observation, reinforce patrols, prepare contingency talks, but do not provoke. Not yet. While the Avanti wasted their cycles chasing shadows, Halran worked in the underbelly of Europa's ice shelf with quiet precision. The Europa aperture ring was nearly complete, but visibility remained the primary threat. Even with external comms masked and fleet patrols off chasing phantom spikes, a thermal or seismic scan from orbit could expose power distribution irregularities during alignment. To counter that, Halran deployed modified blind projectors, civilian mining drones retrofitted with pulse scatter arrays. They hovered around the outer layer of the excavation zone, mimicking crust activity readings and distorting energy gradients into a natural geological scatter. From orbit, Europa's crust now looked like a mildly unstable polar shelf, a phenomenon already documented and, more importantly, routinely ignored. Every precaution taken was grounded in legality. That was Halran's rule. Not a single piece of hardware used was military grade. The aperture ring itself didn't technically violate unified construction codes. It just didn't adhere to modern compliance specs. The key innovation was its use of phase resonance tech, an obsolete method of aperture modulation abandoned decades ago for its imprecision. Where modern gates used quantum-stabilized alignment matrices, Earth's rogue build used timed phase overlap, functionally messy, but perfectly within former standards. The reason no one built with it anymore wasn't regulation, it was reputation. But reputation didn't matter when you'd already been erased. Inside the glacial facility's sealed chamber, the ring finally hummed to life in a test spin. No broadcast signal, no frequency locks, just a pulsing rhythm of phase calibration rippling along the spine of each segment. To the engineers, it was just another test. To Halran, it was proof they were almost ready. Not everything went unnoticed. On Europa's orbital docking platform, a Avanti tech inspector named Arveth had been rotating through civilian compliance checks when he noticed discrepancies in the power logs from the mining station. Power spikes inconsistent with excavation equipment, cooling patterns that suggested quantum regulation, not mechanical strain. He filed a preliminary flag, not an accusation, just a note requesting clarification. The request never reached unified oversight. Instead, it was intercepted by a Dominion-aligned relay handler, who, upon reviewing the falsified logs Halran's team had preceded in the compliance channels, marked the report as a systems calibration error. Arveth was reprimanded for inefficient allocation of audit bandwidth. His clearance was quietly revoked. Back on the surface, Halran reviewed the incident with calm indifference. The pole. He'd known something like this would happen. It always did. That's why the logs were planted days in advance, tailored to explain away any curious eyes before they arrived. He didn't enjoy the manipulation, but survival wasn't a moral debate. It was timing, preparation, and the ability to see how far the enemy would go to avoid seeing the obvious. They wouldn't risk open accusation because that would invite inspection. And if they inspected, they'd see what was actually being built, and then they'd have to explain why they allowed it. Below Europa's south cap, nestled beneath thermal regulators and ice-baffled conduits, the final component was sliding into position. The aperture array was operational. Only one element remained. The Vectra 3. Once a mainline dreadnought built for the Vorel Drift campaign, the Vectra 3 had been declared unsalvageable and quietly mothballed after a drive core implosion that was, in hindsight, engineered. Over the last 3 years, while public funding shifted toward orbital defense initiatives, the Vectra 3 had been slowly stripped, rebuilt and re-outfitted under a series of classified retrofitting cycles listed as structural waste reclamation. No weapon signatures remained. Its engines were modified for heatless drift, no broadcast beacons, its hull lined with reactive absorbent plating. It didn't fly, it glided. And now it rested, silent and unseen, inside a makeshift cradle built into Europa's deepest ice trench. Halran visited it only once during the refit. He stood on its observation deck, watching engineers seal the outer modules, his breath misting in the frigid air. "We're not building a sword," he told his aide. "We're building a footprint." He didn't need the Vectra 3 to fire. He needed it to exist, in the right place at the right time, in a way no one could explain. The pieces were in place. The ghosts had done their work. Now came the moment that mattered. Not a strike, not a message, but the simple act of being seen, where no gate should ever lead. Europa's southern ice shelf had never trembled like that before. Beneath kilometers of glacial compression, in a sealed excavation vault, layered with blind projectors and falsified geothermal readings, the aperture ring exhaled a low harmonic pulse. It wasn't the violent flare of a typical gate ignition, no strobing gravity coils or visible energy arcs, but a slow rolling pressure through space-time, like a tide turning beneath a frozen ocean. The engineers monitoring the ring didn't panic. To them, it was just a mining calibration sequence reaching final sync. But deep in the unmarked sector where the aperture was anchored, Europa's magnetic grid stuttered. Artificial tides shifted. 3 sensor towers blacked out simultaneously. Then, stability. The aperture opened without sound, without light. A displacement curve formed along a vector previously considered impossible. No outbound signature, no transit prep, no unified alignment call. It simply folded. A line, a ripple, a widening lens that did not pierce space but redirected it. And then it held, quiet, stable, unannounced. Half a system away, orbiting a peaceful capital moon cloaked in ceremonial banners and trade symposiums, Veritas slept beneath stars it thought it controlled. The Avanti High Forum was in session that morning. Delegates from 10 corridor sectors debated tariff amendments and fleet rotations, oblivious to what was forming directly above their sky. Commercial traffic flitted lazily between orbital docks. Civilian transport bands cruised below automated defense satellites which remained in passive mode, untroubled, unaware. Then came the bloom. Not a strike, not an explosion, just a shimmer, soft at first, like heat mirage in the cold vacuum. It grew, expanding with precision. The displacement gate snapped into visual range within seconds, catching civilian sensors entirely off-cycle. Initial readouts, it's flagged the anomaly as a gravitational echo, possibly a collision of phase drift. No cause for concern. The civilian network simply labeled it sensor artifact. Traffic control issued a generic advisory, standard protocol. Then the Vectra 3 emerged. It moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of something that had been waiting a very long time. The dreadnought's form slid through the aperture like a knife unsheathing, not fast, not aggressive, but heavy with intent. It made no sound. Its comms remained cold, its weapon bays sealed. But its presence was undeniable, massive, human, unregistered, and above all, impossible. Because there was no gate registered on Veritas, no official entry point aligned to Sol, no transit approvals, no diplomatic channel acknowledgement, yet the Vectra 3 had arrived in perfect position above the capital moon without triggering a single authorized protocol. Inside the High Forum, confusion turned to chaos. Aides stormed in mid-session, carrying emergency overlays and incomplete sensor bursts. The chamber, once buzzing with controlled debate, spiraled into cross-shouting, gesturing, and rising disbelief. Military liaisons were summoned. Diplomatic envoys demanded validation. How had a Terran vessel reached them? Who authorized passage? Was it a rogue faction? Was the vessel weaponized? Emergency defenses, once proudly cited as the most advanced in the corridor, remained idle. The Vectra 3 had entered with no recognizable propulsion signature, no heat bloom, no target lock. The orbital defense net couldn't classify it. Worse, it couldn't explain how it got there. Some systems refused to register it at all, marking the object as spatial distortion mass. Only a handful of old files in restricted archives even recognized the hull pattern. One senator, pale and trembling, muttered that the ship had been scrapped. Another corrected him. It had been, and declared scrapped. Then the message came. A single, wide-band transmission, no voice, just text. Broadcast across every diplomatic frequency Earth had ever used, channels once deemed obsolete and purged from modern protocol. But they still worked. The message pulsed on screens in every chamber, every station, every monitoring node across the system. You closed the gate. We opened one of our own. No follow-up, no threat, just a simple declaration. And yet, within that message was an embedded payload. Earth's original diplomatic transit markers, signed and encrypted by their sovereign key. The code was valid, untouched. But what shocked the Forum most was that it operated outside unified verification architecture. Earth had not spoofed the system. They had bypassed it entirely. The Vectra 3 was legally marked as a sovereign vessel in transit. There was no breach, no violation, just access. Unwelcome, undeniable. Ministerial faces drained of color. Some shouted for military response. Others whispered that if Earth could do this without detection, they could have done worse, much worse. The implications layered in real time. Earth hadn't broken through defenses. It had walked in through a door no one else even saw being built. The entire concept of gate authority, the foundation of Dominion control over travel, diplomacy, commerce, was cracked open in a single moment. And still the Vectra 3 didn't move again. It hovered above Veratus without aggression, without demand, just a presence no censor could dismiss, no policy could overwrite. Back on Europa, Halloran stood in a silent chamber, staring at the deep space feed as the dreadnought completed its final drift. The gate behind it shimmered once more, stabilized, and held. Engineers around him didn't understand the implications. They had built something. But Halloran had delivered proof. Not a weapon. A message. Erasure doesn't work if you can return on your own terms. Earth was not begging for inclusion. It wasn't asking for its gate to be reopened. It had built its own and pointed it at the very heart of the system that tried to forget it existed. There would be no war today. That wasn't the point. The point was, they saw Earth again, and now they couldn't unsee it. The shock didn't ripple outward, it detonated. The moment Earth's aperture stabilized above Veratus, the surrounding sectors fell into a quiet scramble that outpaced even Ivanti containment response. Neutral systems that had long accepted Dominion infrastructure as a necessary bottleneck now saw it for what it was, an illusion of permanence. Earth had found a seam in the galaxy's fabric and stepped through it without permission. And not through rebellion or brute force, but through engineered legitimacy. No threats, no fire. Just a different kind of gate. One the Dominion hadn't approved, couldn't explain, and now couldn't ignore. Within 72 hours, 3 corridor systems paused their compliance renewals with Ivanti transit authorities. 5 more suspended tariff payments, citing protocol re-evaluation. The real blow came from the Tayari Coalition, a cluster of historically passive mining worlds known for their strict neutrality. They moved first, not with warships, but with ink. A sudden, unanimous vote in their assembly ratified a new framework, independent routing authorization, a term Earth had quietly ceded years ago in failed proposals, now repurposed and accepted in full. The Tayari announced a direct trade agreement with Earth, recognizing its aperture as legal transit architecture, equal in authority to the unified lattice. It was the first open defection in decades. The Ivanti didn't fire weapons, not yet, but they tried to fight in the only way that still preserved face, technical suppression. A directive was issued to isolate the aperture feed, to lock the Veritas adjacent orbit out of sensor access and prepare a compression field to disable the gate's endpoint. The problem was that the aperture didn't operate like a standard gate. It didn't draw on unified beacons or registry keys. Its architecture was self-contained, its power cycling closed. Every attempt to override it met only silence. Then came the fail-safes. When Dominion regulators initiated a compression burn sequence, they triggered fallback protocols embedded deep inside the aperture's phase management core, rigged not with explosives, but with signal fractures. Any attempt to collapse the gate without Earth's recalibration would result in a field dispersion event. Not catastrophic, but wide enough to re-anchor the aperture elsewhere. Somewhere else, possibly right over another capital. The message was clear. Try to erase it, and it reappears, untraceable and uncontrolled. The Dominion froze the operation before activation. Too many variables, too much at stake. Still desperate to contain the diplomatic hemorrhaging, the United Council deployed an independent inspection committee, a panel of technocrats from various systems tasked with investigating the Veritas aperture and determining its legality. The inspection was meant to catch Earth in a breach, to validate a response, to reframe the event as sabotage or illegal incursion. Instead, they found nothing to charge. Every component of the Europa Gate traced back to public registries, salvage tech, legacy software, obsolete resonance drivers perfectly capable of phase displacement when configured correctly. No weapons, no cloaking systems, no frequency corruption, just an old tool rebuilt better. The committee returned with their findings without ceremony. No violation, no grounds for censure. Earth had outmaneuvered the very system that excluded it by obeying the rules more cleverly than anyone else ever had. And still, the Vectra 3 didn't move. Above Veritas, it hung like a monument no one had commissioned. An unanswered question with hull plating. It didn't broadcast, didn't scan, didn't orbit. It simply held position, facing nothing, needing nothing, its presence unchanged. The longer it remained, the more destabilizing it became. Not because it was doing anything, but because it was doing nothing in a place it should never have been able to reach. In the interior chambers of the Avanti Ministry of Strategic Continuity, the silence was heavier than any war plan. Strategist Thalkovor stood over a sequence of incident hollows, arms folded, face unreadable. He had built his career on the assumption that law was a weapon wielded with precision, that gate access, route dominance, and infrastructure compliance would always favor those who designed the system. Earth had not shattered that system, it had outflanked it. He zoomed in on the aperture schematic, watching the phase modulation pulse in slow intervals. No tampering, no cloaking layer, just pure, outdated engineering, tuned to a resonance gap no one had thought useful in years. Kovor didn't speak. His subordinates waited. One finally asked if this was an act of escalation. No, Kovor answered, voice low. It's a demonstration, and we gave them the space to build it by assuming they wouldn't. Outside the chamber, ministers still argued policy. Fleet marshals still prepared drills, but none of it mattered. The aperture had made its point. It was not a challenge. It was a presence. And that, more than any weapon, rewrote the board. Years passed, and the galaxy adjusted, but it never quite recovered. What had once been theory, fringe speculation whispered in anti-hegemony circles, now sat at the center of every strategic doctrine seminar across the major academies. They called it asymmetric aperture doctrine, not a tactic but a revelation. Case studies dissected the Europa Gate frame, reverse-engineered the discarded phase resonance tech Earth had weaponized through legality. The incident over Veritas was archived not as an act of aggression, but as a moment that collapsed assumptions. Cadets memorized the vector math of the aperture alignment and studied the silent behavior of the Vectra 3 like theologians passing scripture. Because what Earth had done wasn't just innovative, it was unanswerable. The unified corridors never formally welcomed Earth back. They didn't need to. Trade lanes rerouted naturally. Communications flowed around the gate like rivers shaping new terrain. Embassies reopened under bilateral protocols outside council oversight. No blockade was ever reinstated, no sanction reimposed. Not because Earth demanded access, because it had proven it didn't require it. Every new system Earth entered treated them not as members, but as something else, something adjacent to membership, parallel to diplomacy. Equal but untethered. Earth never reapplied. There was no press conference, no declaration, just a quiet withdrawal from formal submission channels. When asked, Earth's representatives cited infrastructure incompatibility. But the meaning was clear. They would not return to a table that had once been used to lock them out. They didn't need a chair. They had built the room next door. Halron Vex vanished from the public record not long after the Europa aperture stabilized into long-term phase sync. He declined interviews, refused honors, ignored the attempts by Earth's Council to place his name in any official hall. His final communique was short, unrecorded, delivered through secure courier to a single archivist. Don't build myth out of function. The gate works. That's all that matters. They respected his wish. Europa's under-ice facility was converted into a monitoring array and left unmarked. The aperture remained active, quiet, self-sustaining, self-governing. Traffic passed through it sparingly. It wasn't needed for daily commerce. It was something else now. A symbol, proof that infrastructure could be redefined by the ones denied it. One morning, during a routine systems integrity check, a technician stationed at the lower cradle of the gate performed a surface scan along the inner arch. Maintenance protocol, just dust removal, thermal checks, structural pass-throughs. But as he ran the scanner down a seam near the old calibration node, the tool caught on something unexpected. An etched mark, faint but deliberate, just above the power housing. He wiped the surface clean with the edge of his sleeve, leaned in, and read it aloud under his breath. Vex, Nadir Protocol, enacted 4.7-27444. No plaque, no seal, just a timestamp and a name. He stood there longer than required, not in awe, not in reverence, just stillness, because some truths didn't need celebration, just preservation. The gate stayed open. It wasn't dominance that kept it alive, not fear, not alliances, just the knowledge that once, when the system closed its doors, humanity didn't wait to be let back in. They learned how to build a door, how to choose the angle, how to set the frame, how to open it, not as a threat, but as a statement. The kind no one could unmake, and they never closed another gate on us, because we never closed ours. Was building our own gate the ultimate power move, or just the beginning of a new kind of war? Should Earth have walked away, or pushed further? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have kept the gate open? Like this video if you felt the quiet victory hit harder than any battle. Subscribe for more high-stakes HFY stories where humanity doesn't just survive, we redefine the rules.